Across dense forests, mountain valleys, and remote wilderness corridors, search and rescue operations follow strict procedures designed to locate those who fail to return from the wild. Yet in several documented cases, from Malaysia's Ulu Segama Forest Reserve to the frozen slopes linked to Dyatlov Pass, and within heavily monitored regions like Japan's Aokigahara, those procedures have led to outcomes that resist simple explanation. Trained teams enter with clear routes, communication systems, and defined objectives. But in rare instances, even the rescuers do not return as expected. As you move deeper into these accounts, what appears at first to be routine recovery work begins to shift into something less stable. You will encounter search teams that entered to find missing people and never came back on schedule, operations where tracks simply stopped without explanation, and environments where every assumption about navigation and survival is quietly tested by what was left behind. Ulu Segama Forest Reserve, the search team that vanished behind the first missing men. The rainforest stretching across eastern Sabah has a way of swallowing distance and sound until even experienced men begin to lose their sense of direction. And inside the vast wilderness surrounding the Ulu Segama Forest Reserve, where thick tropical canopy blocks sunlight from reaching the forest floor and rivers cut through miles of untouched jungle, entire groups have disappeared under conditions that remain difficult to fully explain. Long before the case attracted wider attention, the reserve already carried a reputation among locals for being physically unforgiving, a place where dense vegetation, sudden storms, steep ravines and disorienting terrain could turn even short journeys into dangerous ones, especially after dark when visibility collapsed into almost complete blackness beneath the trees. What transformed the incident from a difficult missing person case into something far more disturbing was not simply that several men vanished in the forest, but that the rescue party sent to recover them also failed to return, creating a second disappearance inside the same section of wilderness and forcing Malaysian authorities into a search operation large enough to expose how little control anyone truly had once they entered the reserve. The incident unfolded during the early 1990s in Sabah, Malaysian Borneo, near one of the oldest tropical rainforest regions on Earth. The forests surrounding Ulu Segama form part of a broader ecosystem connected to the Danam Valley Conservation Area, a terrain known for extreme humidity, dangerous wildlife, and jungle density severe enough to interfere with visibility only a few meters ahead. Even trained forestry personnel working in these environments often relied on rivers, cut paths, and local guides because the landscape itself could become deceptively repetitive. Towering dipterocarp trees rose above the canopy at heights exceeding 200 feet, while below them tangled vines, wet undergrowth, and steep muddy slopes slowed movement to a crawl. The first group consisted of 5 fishermen who reportedly entered the forested region and never returned. Accounts surrounding exactly why they travelled into the area differ depending on later retellings, but reports consistently describe the men disappearing somewhere inside the reserve, prompting concern severe enough for local authorities to organise a search effort. At first, the situation appeared tragic but understandable. Tropical forests across Southeast Asia have historically produced cases where hikers, hunters, and workers become disoriented and succumb to exposure, injury, flooding, or exhaustion before rescuers can reach them. Yet what followed transformed the operation into one of the region's strangest disappearance cases. A 9-man search and rescue team was deployed into the reserve to locate the missing fishermen. Unlike the original group, these men were not entering the forest casually or without preparation. Search teams operating in Sabah during this period were accustomed to difficult jungle conditions, and local rescuers understood how rapidly weather and terrain could become deadly. Heavy rainfall could erase tracks within minutes. River currents could rise suddenly after storms occurring miles away upstream. Radio communication often became unreliable beneath dense canopies and uneven terrain. Still, the deployment of trained searchers suggested authorities believed the operation remained manageable. Then communication with the rescue team itself reportedly stopped. When the searchers failed to return, anxiety surrounding the operation escalated immediately because authorities were no longer dealing with a single missing group lost somewhere in the dangerous wilderness. Now, 2 separate parties had vanished in the same region, including men specifically trained or assigned to conduct recovery operations inside hostile terrain. The psychological effect of this second disappearance spread quickly through nearby communities because it suggested something beyond ordinary navigational failure. Experienced jungle workers understood how easy it was for one exhausted individual to become lost, but an entire rescue unit disappearing raised more unsettling questions. In response, Malaysian authorities launched a far larger operation involving approximately 80 personnel, including police, forestry workers, and additional rescue members tasked with locating both the fishermen and the missing search party. The scale of the deployment reflected growing fear that conditions inside the reserve had become catastrophic. Large jungle searches are extraordinarily difficult even under ideal circumstances because tropical rainforests actively destroy evidence. Footprints vanish beneath rainfall, broken vegetation recovers quickly, waterways alter routes and erase trails. Human scent disperses rapidly in humid conditions, limiting the effectiveness of tracking efforts. Inside Borneo's forests, even helicopters face limitations because the canopy can become so dense that visibility from above is nearly useless. Search aircraft may pass directly over missing individuals without seeing them at all. At ground level, rescuers are often forced to cut their way through vegetation while dealing with insects, leeches, unstable terrain, dehydration, and constant disorientation. Distances that appear short on maps can require entire days to cross. As the larger operation moved deeper into the reserve, reports described severe environmental conditions hampering the search. Rainfall and difficult terrain slowed movement, while communication problems complicated coordination between teams. Some accounts later connected the disappearances to local beliefs surrounding the forest itself, including long-standing indigenous stories warning that certain areas of Sabah's jungle should not be entered carelessly. Borneo's forests contain deep traditions involving spirits, hidden places, and regions believed capable of confusing or misleading travellers. Such beliefs were not unusual in isolated jungle communities where generations had watched experienced hunters vanish under circumstances nobody could fully reconstruct afterward. Even among practical search personnel, the atmosphere surrounding the operation reportedly became increasingly tense because the absence of evidence made the disappearances difficult to understand. There were no widely documented signs of violent attack, no confirmed campsite discoveries that clearly explained what happened, and no immediate indication that either group had successfully exited the reserve. The forest simply seemed to absorb them. The geography of eastern Sabah intensified the danger. Ulu Segama lies within terrain marked by thick valleys, hidden ravines, flooded river systems, and unstable jungle routes where visibility can collapse almost instantly once rainfall begins. Heat exhaustion and dehydration remain constant threats despite the wet environment because high humidity prevents the body from cooling effectively. Insects carrying disease, venomous snakes concealed beneath vegetation, and the possibility of encounters with wild animals added further risks. But environmental danger alone did not entirely explain why multiple groups disappeared in succession. Search operations inside tropical rainforests often depend heavily on sound because the visual range is so limited. Teams use whistles, shouted calls, radios, and machete strikes against trees to maintain awareness of nearby personnel. In a dense jungle, however, sound behaves unpredictably. Rainfall, insects, river currents, and echoing vegetation distort direction, making voices appear farther away or closer than they really are. At night, the forest becomes even more psychologically oppressive. Darkness arrives quickly near the equator, and beneath a heavy canopy, there are few visual reference points. Many experienced jungle workers have described the sensation of losing spatial awareness after sunset, where familiar terrain suddenly becomes alien within minutes. Several retellings of the incident over the years have blurred factual details with rumour, making it difficult to separate verified events from local folklore that grew afterward. Some later versions exaggerated the disappearances into supernatural narratives, while others connected them to stories involving hidden spirits or cursed regions of forest. What remains consistent across documented accounts is the core reality that two separate groups vanished in the same reserve, including a search party specifically sent to locate the first missing men. Cases involving rescuers disappearing alongside those they were searching for occupy a particularly disturbing place in wilderness history because they undermine public confidence in the idea that trained personnel can restore order to dangerous situations. Search teams represent structure, preparation, and expertise entering chaos. When they vanish too, the environment itself begins to feel uncontrollable. Similar fears have emerged in other remote disappearances across forests, mountains, and polar regions. where rescuers discovered that the same terrain-swallowing victims could just as easily consume those attempting to recover them. Sabah's forests have continued to produce missing person incidents over the decades, though most eventually receive ordinary explanations involving injury, weather exposure, or navigational failure. Yet the Ulu Segama case endured because of the sequence itself. One missing group could be understood as an accident. The disappearance of the rescue party transformed the incident into something psychologically darker, especially within communities familiar with how experienced jungle personnel normally operate. The broader region surrounding Danum Valley and Ulu Segama remains one of the most biologically complex rainforest ecosystems on the planet. Scientists working there have documented rare species, isolated terrain, and environmental conditions capable of changing rapidly without warning. During heavy storms, rivers can flood unexpectedly and transform passable ground into deadly channels of mud and debris. Dense canopy also interferes with navigation tools, and before modern GPS systems became widespread, many search operations depended heavily on physical orientation and local environmental familiarity. A single navigational mistake could slowly compound until rescuers themselves became separated from safe routes. Yet despite all reasonable environmental explanations, the case continued circulating in Malaysian media and regional folklore because no definitive public account ever fully resolved how both groups disappeared inside the same wilderness zone. The unanswered gaps allowed the story to persist in an uneasy space between documented search failure and modern legend. Over time, the forest itself became central to the mystery, portrayed not simply as the location where the disappearances occurred, but as an active force that erased those entering it. Even today, discussions surrounding Ulu Segama often focus less on what specifically happened to the fishermen, and more on the moment the rescue team also vanished, because that second disappearance fundamentally altered the meaning of the case. The operation stopped being a recovery mission and became evidence that the forest could overwhelm even organised attempts to fight against it. Somewhere beneath the canopy of Sabah's rainforest, where rivers still move through valleys untouched by roads and sunlight rarely reaches the ground intact, the silence surrounding both missing groups has never fully lifted. Dyatlov Pass, the rescue party that found something worse than death. A line of dark ridges rose above the northern Urals as the first volunteer searchers pushed skis through fresh snow toward the route the hikers were supposed to have already left behind. Winter storms had covered much of the mountain range in deep drifts by the time concern finally escalated into a coordinated search effort, and the landscape surrounding Kholat Syakhl already looked hostile enough to explain a delayed expedition without invoking anything unusual. The region was isolated even by Soviet standards, with vast distances separating settlements from the barren slopes where the hiking group had last been seen, and temperatures in early February routinely falling far below freezing once darkness settled across the mountains. By the third week of February 1959, concerns surrounding the Dyatlov expedition had begun spreading far beyond the institute, where the students and graduates were expected to report back. The group, led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, consisted of experienced hikers and skiers attempting a difficult trek across the northern Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union. Most were young engineering students or graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, and several possessed advanced certifications in backcountry travel. Their route toward Mount Utorten had been considered demanding but achievable for a team with their experience. When no telegram or communication arrived by the expected date, relatives initially assumed weather conditions had slowed their progress, but as more days passed without contact, anxiety grew harder to dismiss. Nothing about the missing group initially suggested the kind of mystery that would later surround the mountain. Soviet hiking expeditions often encountered delays caused by storms, injuries, or navigational difficulties, particularly in remote winter terrain where progress could collapse to only a few miles per day. Search efforts therefore began cautiously, first involving fellow students and volunteers before expanding to include military personnel, local guides, and aircraft support. The assumption at that stage remained relatively simple. Somewhere in the snow-covered wilderness, the Dyatlov group was stranded, injured, or waiting out severe weather conditions. Across the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl, wind moved loose snow in long sheets that continuously erased signs of movement almost as quickly as they formed. The mountain itself carried an ominous translation from the language of the indigenous Mansi people, often rendered as Dead Mountain. though the name historically referred more to the lack of game in the area than to anything supernatural. Even so, the exposed terrain surrounding the pass created a bleak atmosphere that rescuers later described as deeply unsettling. There were no forests across the upper slopes, no natural shelter from incoming winds, and almost no landmarks capable of breaking the endless whiteness stretching across the ridgelines. The tent appeared suddenly against the white hillside, partially collapsed beneath drifting snow, and standing far higher on the exposed slope than rescuers expected any experienced hikers to camp. Searchers spotted it on February 26, nearly a month after the expedition had departed. At first glance, the scene looked abandoned rather than catastrophic, but the closer the investigators moved toward the campsite, the stranger the details became. The tent remained partially standing despite harsh weather, suggesting it had not been destroyed by avalanche force or violent collapse. Ski poles still supported sections of the structure, while snow accumulation indicated the shelter had remained exposed for some time before discovery. Inside the canvas shelter, investigators encountered details that immediately disrupted ordinary explanations for what had happened during the night. Personal belongings remained scattered throughout the tent, including boots, heavy winter clothing, food supplies, cameras, notebooks, and equipment that experienced hikers would never willingly abandon in sub-zero temperatures. Meals appeared partially prepared. Blankets and jackets remained behind. Whatever caused the group to leave the shelter had apparently happened so suddenly that several members exited without adequate protection against the freezing conditions outside. Cuts running through the side of the tent suggested that at least some members of the Dyatlov group had forced their way outward from inside the shelter instead of leaving normally through the entrance. Investigators later determined that the slashes had been made from within the tent fabric itself, an observation that became one of the central mysteries of the entire Dyatlov Pass incident. If the hikers had calmly evacuated because of structural damage or snow accumulation, there would have been little reason to cut open the side of the shelter rather than use the entrance flap. The evidence instead implied panic, urgency, or fear strong enough to override rational survival behavior in one of the coldest environments imaginable. Footprints descending away from the campsite traveled toward a distant patch of forest at the edge of the slope. Rescuers documented tracks left by several individuals moving downhill in a relatively ordered manner rather than fleeing chaotically, though many of the prints were faint beneath drifting snow. Some appeared to have been made by people wearing socks or bare feet instead of insulated boots. The trail extended for roughly a mile before disappearing near the tree line, where the landscape changed from open mountain slope into dense forest shadowed beneath towering cedar trees. Beneath a large cedar tree near the tree line, the search party discovered the first two bodies lying beside the remains of a small fire. The men, identified as Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko, were found wearing little clothing despite temperatures estimated at -30 degrees Celsius. Investigators observed burns on the branches above the fire site, suggesting one or both men had climbed the tree at some point, possibly to look back toward the tent or search for light on the mountain slope above them. Their hands showed signs of injury and damaged skin consistent with prolonged exposure to extreme cold and attempts to gather wood or maintain the fire. Several hundred meters uphill from the cedar, additional bodies began appearing in positions that implied desperate attempts to return toward the tent. Igor Dyatlov himself was discovered partially buried in snow, followed by Zinaida Kolmogorova and Rustem Slobodin farther along the same route. The spacing between the bodies created the impression of a fragmented retreat, as though members of the group had become separated while attempting to climb back toward the campsite after initially leaving it. Slobodin reportedly suffered a skull fracture, though investigators concluded the injury alone was not immediately fatal. Hypothermia appeared responsible for several deaths, yet the broader sequence of events remained impossible to reconstruct cleanly. For weeks, the mountain continued withholding the final members of the expedition beneath deep snow and ice. Spring conditions slowly altered the landscape, while search operations expanded across nearby ravines and forested depressions where drifting snow could conceal bodies for months. The delay intensified speculation because the first discoveries already raised serious contradictions. Why had experienced hikers abandoned critical winter gear? Why had they separated across the slope instead of remaining together? What threat inside or outside the tent had convinced them to leave in near total darkness? When investigators eventually uncovered the remaining hikers inside a nearby ravine, the condition of the bodies transformed the case into something far more disturbing. The last 4 victims were discovered beneath heavy snow cover in May 1959, several months after the initial searches began. Unlike the earlier bodies found exposed on the slope, these individuals wore additional clothing apparently removed from other group members after death, suggesting at least some survivors attempted to adapt and preserve warmth following the initial evacuation from the tent. Massive chest fractures and skull injuries found on some victims appeared comparable to the force produced by serious vehicle collisions, yet external wounds remained strangely limited. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov both suffered catastrophic chest trauma, while Nikolai Thibault-Brignol sustained severe skull damage. Soviet forensic specialist Boris Vozrojdeny reportedly remarked that the force causing certain injuries resembled the impact of a car crash. Yet unlike victims of blunt assault, the bodies displayed relatively little external soft tissue damage corresponding to the severity of the internal fractures. One of the most discussed discoveries involved the absence of soft tissue injuries that investigators struggled to explain publicly for decades afterward. Dubinina was found missing her tongue, eyes, and portions of facial tissue, while some of the other victims also lacked eyes. Later, forensic interpretation suggested post-mortem decomposition in flowing water and natural scavenging could account for several of these injuries, particularly because the ravine bodies had remained beneath snow near running meltwater for months. Even so, the visual details emerging from official reports and photographs deeply unsettled both investigators and the public, especially when combined with the unusual circumstances surrounding the group's final movements. Radiation traces reportedly detected on portions of clothing introduced another layer of uncertainty into an investigation already collapsing beneath contradictory evidence. Some members of the Dyatlov group had previously worked in environments connected to radioactive materials through university or industrial assignments, offering one possible explanation, but the discovery fueled speculation that military testing or classified Soviet activity might somehow have intersected with the expedition. Additional rumours spread after reports surfaced describing strange orange lights seen in the sky around the northern Urals during the same period, though no definitive connection between those sightings and the Dyatlov Pass incident was ever established. Throughout the Soviet inquiry, officials repeatedly avoided offering definitive conclusions capable of explaining every detail found on the mountain. The final case documents eventually stated that the hikers died because of a compelling natural force, which they were unable to overcome, a phrase so vague that it effectively admitted investigators could not confidently reconstruct the sequence of events. Portions of the case remained classified for years, while other documents later appeared incomplete or missing when archives were reopened decades afterward. These gaps intensified suspicion that authorities withheld information, although no conclusive evidence proving a cover-up has ever fully emerged. Testimonies from rescuers and investigators later revealed how psychologically unsettling the recovery operation had become, even for those accustomed to harsh winter conditions. Many participants entered the mountains expecting an ordinary accident investigation, and instead encountered evidence that resisted logical arrangement. The tent location appeared irrational, the footprints contradicted panic, the injuries exceeded ordinary exposure deaths. Every attempt to impose a clean narrative onto the scene left important details unexplained. Even investigators who favoured natural explanations acknowledged that the totality of evidence created an atmosphere unlike typical wilderness fatalities. Over time, the Dyatlov Pass incident evolved from a tragic expedition failure into one of the most analysed wilderness mysteries in modern history. Researchers, journalists, scientists, and independent investigators repeatedly revisited the case using avalanche modelling, weather reconstruction, topographic analysis, and forensic review. Some modern studies propose that a delayed slab avalanche or sudden snow collapse forced the hikers from the tent temporarily before hypothermia and confusion led to the fatal sequence of events. Others argued that katabatic winds, infrasound-induced panic, military testing, interpersonal conflict or hidden environmental factors better explained the evidence. None of the theories resolved every contradiction completely. Decades of theories involving avalanches, military testing, katabatic winds, infrasound, and human conflict continued circling the same central problem that confronted the original rescue teams on the slope. The Dyatlov search party entered the Urals expecting to retrieve stranded hikers from a dangerous mountain environment. but what they ultimately discovered resembled the aftermath of something nobody present could confidently define. The mystery endured precisely because the evidence remained physical and measurable while still refusing to fit together in a coherent way. Even after official case files resurfaced years later, critical gaps and inconsistencies continued fueling suspicion that parts of the investigation had never been fully disclosed. Modern Russia reopened the case briefly in 2019 before again favouring avalanche-related conclusions, yet public fascination never faded because the emotional centre of the incident remained untouched by official explanations. Searchers climbed onto Kholat Syakhl expecting to find cold, hunger, or exposure. Instead, they encountered a campsite where experienced hikers had abandoned safety in the middle of the night and scattered themselves across the mountain beneath conditions that still resist complete explanation. The last tracks leading away from the tent still ended at the edge of the forest, with nobody able to explain what the hikers believed was waiting behind them on the mountain: Nanda Devi, the nuclear device lost in the ice. Above the deep valley surrounding Nanda Devi, walls of ice and granite isolated one of the most dangerous mountains in the Himalayas from nearly everything below it. Rising more than 25,000 feet above northern India, the peak remained physically intimidating, even to experienced climbers because of its violent weather, unstable glaciers, and narrow access routes threading through steep gorges that could become impassable without warning. For centuries, the mountain carried spiritual significance throughout the region, while mountaineers regarded it with a different kind of respect rooted in survival rather than reverence. By the middle of the 20th century, however, the remote isolation surrounding Nanda Devi began attracting attention for reasons that had nothing to do with exploration or religion, drawing intelligence agencies toward terrain where even ordinary climbing expeditions already struggled to return safely. During the height of the Cold War, growing concern over Chinese nuclear activity pushed American and Indian intelligence agencies toward increasingly extreme surveillance operations. In October 1964, China successfully detonated its first nuclear weapon at Lop Nur, fundamentally altering strategic calculations throughout Asia and alarming both the United States and India. Washington urgently wanted reliable information regarding future Chinese missile launches and nuclear testing, particularly because satellite surveillance remained limited during that period. American intelligence officials therefore explored alternative methods capable of monitoring missile activity across western China from high-altitude locations inside the Himalayas. Few people involved in the mission fully understood that the equipment being carried toward the mountain included radioactive material designed to operate unattended for years at high altitude. The operation reportedly involved cooperation between the Central Intelligence Agency and India's Intelligence Bureau, combining American surveillance technology with Indian mountaineering expertise familiar with Himalayan terrain. At the center of the mission stood a radioisotope thermoelectric generator powered by plutonium-238, intended to provide continuous electricity for remote monitoring equipment placed high on Nanda Devi. The generator itself weighed several pounds and generated heat through radioactive decay, allowing the surveillance system to function in extreme cold where ordinary batteries would fail quickly. High along the climbing route, members of the covert expedition struggled against worsening weather as winds and snowfall began overtaking the upper slopes. The team included experienced Indian climbers led by celebrated mountaineer Manmohan Singh Kohli, alongside personnel connected to the covert intelligence operation. Transporting the equipment through Himalayan conditions proved extraordinarily difficult because every component had to be carried manually across dangerous terrain, already notorious for avalanches and sudden storms. Oxygen levels decreased sharply with altitude, while heavy snow and ice complicated movement along narrow ridges and unstable glacier sections. Conditions near the mountain deteriorated so rapidly that the team eventually faced a decision that none of them expected to make before the ascent began. Storm systems moving across the Himalayas can transform climbing routes within hours, and on Nanda Devi, the consequences of delay become increasingly severe because retreat itself carries enormous risk. According to later accounts, the expedition realized it could no longer safely continue upward while transporting the heavy surveillance device through worsening weather. The possibility of climbers becoming stranded at extreme altitude threatened the entire mission. Rather than risk transporting the heavy surveillance device through intensifying storm conditions, the climbers secured the equipment near the mountain with plans to retrieve it later, Reports indicated that the plutonium-powered generator and associated monitoring equipment were lashed to the mountain in what the team believed was a stable location, capable of surviving winter conditions until the following climbing season. The decision reflected confidence that the cache would remain where it had been left. Although storms, snow accumulation, and ice movement posed obvious hazards, the operation assumed the device could later be recovered through another expedition once weather conditions improved. Months afterward, another recovery mission returned to Nanda Devi, expecting a difficult climb but a relatively straightforward recovery operation. The atmosphere surrounding the second expedition differed sharply from the urgency of the original deployment because the intelligence teams believed they already knew where the equipment had been secured. Their primary challenge involved reaching the location safely rather than searching for missing hardware across an enormous glacier system. Yet as the climbers approached the original cache site, confidence surrounding the operation reportedly began collapsing. Search efforts around the original cache site quickly produced a discovery far more alarming than damaged equipment or avalanche debris. The device was no longer there. The plutonium-powered generator had completely disappeared from the location where the previous expedition believed it had been secured. Snow accumulation and shifting terrain complicated visibility, but investigators reportedly found no clear evidence that the equipment remained intact nearby. The disappearance immediately transformed the mission into something far more dangerous than a failed surveillance operation, because the missing object contained radioactive material capable of contaminating glacier systems if damaged or exposed. What made the situation even more disturbing was that the mountain offered no obvious explanation for where the generator had gone. Glacier movement offered one possible explanation, though it immediately raised fears about where the radioactive device might eventually travel beneath the ice. Himalayan glaciers do not remain static. Massive ice fields shift slowly over time, carrying rock, debris, and anything trapped within them through hidden crevasses and meltwater systems that can extend for miles beneath the surface. Avalanches may also bury objects beneath enormous layers of compacted snow and fractured ice almost instantly. If the generator had fallen into a crevasse or become trapped beneath glacier movement, recovering it could become nearly impossible. Additional expeditions searched sections of the mountain and surrounding terrain while confronting avalanches, unstable snowfields, and severe altitude conditions that repeatedly disrupted recovery attempts. Several accounts describe how teams continued climbing into dangerous areas, attempting to relocate the missing device, but the mountain consistently refused to reveal anything definitive. Unlike ordinary recovery operations where debris, equipment, or trace evidence eventually emerges, the Nanda Devi mission seemed to produce only uncertainty. The search teams knew precisely what they were looking for, yet the Himalayas appeared capable of absorbing the entire generator without leaving visible signs behind. Far below the upper slopes, meltwater flowing from Himalayan glaciers fed river systems relied upon by enormous populations across northern India. This reality introduced a deeper layer of fear surrounding the missing device, because scientists and environmental observers later questioned whether radioactive material from the generator could eventually enter waters connected to the Ganges river system. Although definitive evidence of contamination has never publicly emerged, the mere possibility created enormous concern given the scale of the population depending on those waterways. The mountain no longer represented only a failed intelligence mission. It potentially concealed a long-term environmental threat buried somewhere within the ice. Reports surrounding the missing generator remained limited for years, as intelligence agencies avoided extensive public discussion of the operation and its failure. Much of what later became known about the Nanda Devi mission emerged gradually through journalistic investigations, memoirs, and declassified material rather than direct public disclosure at the time of the incident. The secrecy surrounding Cold War intelligence operations contributed heavily to the mystery, because officials rarely addressed the details openly, allowing speculation to grow around what exactly had happened during the recovery attempts. Indian officials eventually authorized another surveillance installation on a neighboring peak after confidence in recovering the original device continued to collapse. Rather than permanently abandoning the intelligence objective, later operations shifted focus toward nearby Nanda Kot, where another monitoring system was reportedly established under less dangerous conditions. The decision quietly acknowledged a disturbing reality. After multiple recovery attempts, the original plutonium-powered generator on Nanda Devi was effectively considered lost. Questions surrounding the Nanda Devi mission persisted because the missing object was not a rumour, legend or disputed witness account, but a documented nuclear-powered device that simply vanished. Unlike folklore-driven wilderness mysteries, the operation involved government agencies, experienced climbers, and physical equipment whose existence has never seriously been denied. The uncertainty centres not on whether the device existed, but on where it ultimately went after the storm forced the original team to leave it behind. Unlike ordinary mountaineering disasters, the mystery surrounding Nanda Devi involved trained recovery teams repeatedly climbing back into the same hostile environment, searching for something that should still have been there. That detail transformed the operation into a uniquely unsettling case, because every subsequent expedition entered the mountain believing the problem remained solvable. The generator was not invisible. It was not small enough to disappear easily. Yet the glacier system surrounding Nanda Devi repeatedly defeated efforts to recover it, as though the mountain itself had absorbed the operation into its shifting ice fields. Decades later, environmental researchers and journalists continued revisiting the possibility that the lost generator may remain trapped somewhere within the Himalayan glacier system. Modern discussions surrounding climate change and glacial retreat occasionally revived concern about what might eventually emerge if long frozen sections of ice begin melting more rapidly in the future. Although experts disagree regarding the likelihood of significant contamination, uncertainty persists largely because nobody has ever publicly demonstrated that the original device was recovered or destroyed. Satellite imagery, modern climbing expeditions, and later investigations never produced conclusive evidence explaining exactly where the device ultimately went after disappearing from the mountain. Avalanches may have buried it permanently beneath tons of compacted snow and ice. Glacier movement may have carried it deep into inaccessible crevasses. Portions of the equipment may have broken apart and dispersed across hidden channels beneath the surface. Every explanation remains possible precisely because the Himalayas never returned enough evidence to eliminate uncertainty. Beneath shifting layers of snow and ice, the unanswered fate of the Nanda Devi generator continued lingering as one of the strangest unresolved operations of the Cold War. The original climbers survived the mission. The recovery teams reached the mountain repeatedly. The device itself was real, documented, and dangerous. Yet despite all the planning, technology, and manpower invested into retrieving it, the Himalayas ultimately reduced the operation to a question that still has no verified answer. Hidden within the ice fields surrounding Nanda Devi, the missing generator may remain in the same frozen silence that defeated every recovery mission sent to retrieve it. The missing 4-on-1 pattern. The search areas where tracking dogs suddenly stop. Radio traffic drifting through wilderness search operations often becomes quieter as the hours pass and the probability of finding someone alive begins slowly collapsing. At the beginning of most missing person searches, communication remains fast, procedural, and confident as teams establish coordinates, assign routes, deploy aircraft, and organize search grids across forests or mountain terrain. Over time, however, the tone usually changes, batteries weaken, visibility deteriorates. Exhaustion settles over personnel moving through steep wilderness in darkness or bad weather. In certain cases discussed for years among search and rescue workers across North America, the silence that eventually follows has proven more unsettling than the disappearance itself because the evidence begins behaving in ways experienced rescuers struggle to explain afterward. Thousands of people disappear inside North American forests, mountain ranges, and national parks every year under circumstances that investigators eventually resolve through exposure, injury, drowning, or navigational error. Vast wilderness areas naturally generate accidents because weather changes quickly, terrain becomes deceptive, and panic often causes lost individuals to make increasingly dangerous decisions. Dense forests interfere with visibility and radio communication. Mountain environments distort distance and orientation. Rivers erase tracks rapidly. Search and rescue professionals understand these realities better than almost anyone, which is why most missing person investigations ultimately remain tragic but explainable. Certain search and rescue personnel, however, have described a smaller category of cases that continued troubling them long after official operations ended. These incidents did not necessarily involve impossible events or supernatural claims. Instead, they produced combinations of details that resisted clean reconstruction. Search dogs abruptly lost scent trails. Weather interfered with operations at critical moments. Bodies later appeared in areas already searched repeatedly. Young children vanished over distances investigators considered improbable. Experienced outdoorsmen disappeared in terrain they should have understood well. Individually, none of these details guaranteed mystery. Collectively, they formed patterns that some rescuers quietly admitted they never fully understood. Former police officer David Paulides spent years collecting reports and records connected to disappearances he believed shared unusually consistent characteristics across different wilderness regions. Through his missing 411 investigations, Paulides focused heavily on national parks, forests, and remote recreational areas where missing person cases appeared to cluster under recurring circumstances. His work attracted significant public attention because it assembled incidents from separate decades and locations into what looked like a broader pattern rather than isolated accidents. At the same time, critics argued that many of the cases relied on incomplete information, selective presentation, or details capable of ordinary explanation when examined individually. Large-scale search efforts are specifically designed to reduce uncertainty by saturating terrain with personnel, aircraft, tracking dogs, and coordinated grid patterns. Wilderness searches follow structured procedures refined through decades of rescue operations. Teams divide terrain into sectors, document findings carefully, and repeatedly sweep likely travel corridors based on behavior analysis and environmental conditions. Aircraft monitor clearings and ridgelines from above, while canine units search for scent trails. The system exists precisely because wilderness environments are capable of concealing people surprisingly well, even across relatively limited areas. Tracking dogs occasionally lose scent trails because of weather, water movement, terrain disruption, or the natural limitations of animal tracking itself. Experienced handlers readily acknowledge that scent work is complicated and imperfect, especially in mountainous or heavily forested environments where wind, rain, and temperature shifts can distort odor movement. Rivers and rocky terrain may interrupt scent continuity entirely. Yet within some missing 411 cases, handlers later described situations where dogs behaved unusually hesitant or abruptly stopped tracking at precise points without obvious environmental explanation. Several missing 411 cases nevertheless describe handlers reporting that dogs stopped abruptly at precise locations where trails appeared to vanish without clear continuation. In some accounts, the animals reportedly circled areas repeatedly before refusing to move farther, while in others, they tracked normally for extended distances only to lose all indication of direction suddenly. Skeptics have pointed out that such behavior can result from countless ordinary environmental factors invisible to humans, but the repetition of similar reports across unrelated cases contributed heavily to the unease surrounding the missing 411 pattern. Deep inside the Great Smoky Mountains during the summer of 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin disappeared while playing near a family campsite. The disappearance occurred near Spence Field along the Tennessee-North Carolina border during a Father's Day outing. According to accounts from family members, Dennis briefly hid with other children during a game before failing to reappear moments later. The area surrounding the campsite consisted of steep wooded terrain capable of becoming dangerous very quickly, particularly for a child moving alone through dense undergrowth. Massive search operations involving the National Guard, volunteers, Green Berets, and local authorities combed the surrounding wilderness for days without locating the missing child. Search teams encountered heavy rain and difficult terrain that complicated tracking efforts, while helicopters and trained personnel repeatedly swept the region looking for any sign of movement or evidence. Despite the enormous scale of the operation, no confirmed trace of Dennis Martin was ever found. The case eventually became one of the most discussed disappearances connected to the Great Smoky Mountains, not because investigators proved anything extraordinary occurred, but because the child seemed to vanish almost immediately within an area filled with searchers. Accounts from experienced search personnel involved in some wilderness disappearances occasionally described moments where ordinary search logic appeared to stop functioning normally. In many missing 411 discussions, rescuers emphasized not paranormal experiences but professional frustration. Search probabilities failed unexpectedly. Terrain produced inconsistent results. Evidence surfaced in locations contradicting earlier assumptions. The discomfort came from operational breakdown rather than fear itself. Many rescuers entered these environments expecting difficult but manageable searches, and instead encountered situations where established methods stopped producing reliable answers. children featured prominently in many of the cases later discussed within the missing 411 investigations, particularly incidents involving extremely rapid disappearances in rugged terrain. Some recovered children later described confusing or fragmented memories of their experiences, while others were discovered miles from their last known locations despite terrain that adults would have struggled to cross quickly. Experts caution that wilderness searches involving children are especially unpredictable because frightened minors often behave irrationally or continue moving after becoming lost, but the distances involved in several documented cases nevertheless unsettled experienced investigators. Remote sections of national parks such as Yosemite, Crater Lake and Rocky Mountain National Park repeatedly surfaced in discussions surrounding unusual missing person patterns. These areas share several characteristics common to wilderness disappearances: immense terrain, rapidly changing weather, cliffs, rivers, dense forest cover, and large numbers of annual visitors. In Yosemite National Park alone, steep granite landscapes and isolated backcountry regions have produced fatal accidents and unresolved disappearances for decades. The missing 411 investigations drew attention to how certain geographic regions appeared repeatedly in unexplained cases, though critics argued this largely reflected visitor volume and environmental hazard rather than genuine anomaly. Experienced outdoorsmen and hunters also appeared throughout several cases because their disappearances challenged assumptions about survival knowledge and wilderness familiarity. One reason such incidents attracted attention was that seasoned hikers and hunters generally understand navigation, weather behaviour, and environmental risk far better than casual visitors. When these individuals vanished under circumstances leaving little evidence behind, the cases naturally generated greater unease among rescuers who expected experienced outdoorsmen to leave clearer survival indicators. Harsh weather conditions frequently complicated wilderness searches, though some investigators privately noted how storms or fog seemed to emerge at especially critical moments during operations. Sudden rainfall can erase tracks within minutes, while snowfall buries evidence and dramatically alters terrain visibility. Fog limits helicopter support and visual scanning. Search and rescue professionals understand that wilderness weather changes rapidly, without any mysterious cause, yet repeated cases where environmental conditions deteriorated immediately after disappearances contributed to the psychological atmosphere surrounding the missing 411 pattern. Bodies recovered in previously searched locations became another recurring source of frustration for some SAR teams working in difficult terrain. In several documented incidents, missing individuals were later found in areas rescuers believed had already been thoroughly examined. Search experts caution that this phenomenon can occur naturally because wilderness visibility is imperfect, particularly in dense vegetation, steep ravines, or snow-covered environments where bodies may remain concealed despite repeated passes. Even so, the emotional effect on rescuers can be deeply unsettling because it creates the impression that the terrain itself withheld evidence until long after the search should have succeeded. Distances involved in certain recoveries occasionally intensified the mystery, because victims were discovered far beyond the range rescuers initially believed possible. Cases involving young children found at high elevations or across difficult terrain particularly attracted attention, because investigators struggled to understand how the individuals reached those locations unaided. Some experts attributed these scenarios to underestimated survival movement, adrenaline, or incomplete timeline reconstruction, while others admitted that certain travel distances remained difficult to explain confidently. Hypothermia experts have documented how exposure can produce irrational behaviour, confusion, paradoxical undressing, and unexpected movement patterns in wilderness environments. Many details frequently cited within missing 411 discussions, therefore, possess potential medical or environmental explanations grounded in survival science. Victims suffering cognitive impairment from cold exposure may remove clothing, travel in illogical directions, or seek confined spaces while disoriented. Search patterns can also fail because lost individuals continue moving unpredictably after initial disappearance points. Skeptics of the missing 411 theory, therefore, argued that many supposedly mysterious disappearances reflected incomplete information, distorted retellings, environmental confusion, or ordinary wilderness hazards misunderstood after the fact. Critics also noted that large databases of missing person cases naturally produce unusual coincidences and recurring details, without requiring a hidden explanation. Wilderness environments are chaotic by nature, and public fascination often amplifies the strangest elements while overlooking mundane contributing factors. Even critics of the broader Missing 411 narrative, however, acknowledge that remote terrain can generate search operations where evidence disappears quickly and reconstruction becomes extremely difficult. Search and rescue workers repeatedly emphasize that forests, ravines, rivers, cliffs, and mountains behave differently from controlled urban environments. A single missed turn or injury may rapidly escalate into fatal isolation. Human beings also tend to overestimate how visible someone should be in wilderness terrain. Entire search teams have passed within short distances of missing individuals without realizing it. Among search and rescue veterans, the most unsettling cases were often not the ones involving obvious tragedy, but the ones where critical details never aligned cleanly afterward. The emotional burden of wilderness searches frequently comes from unanswered questions rather than confirmed deaths. Why did the trail stop there? Why was the body found in that location? Why did the dogs refuse the scent? Why did no witness hear or see anything despite proximity? These questions linger because rescuers are trained to impose order on confusion, and certain disappearances resist that process entirely. Forests, ravines, mountain trails, and river systems across North America continued producing disappearances that investigators solved only partially or not at all. The missing 411 pattern persisted not because every case proved something extraordinary occurred, but because enough trained personnel emerged from certain operations carrying the same quiet discomfort that the wilderness had behaved unpredictably around them. Search teams entered these environments expecting terrain, weather, and survival variables. What unsettled some of them afterward was the growing realization that a handful of cases still seemed incomplete, even after every official explanation had already been written down. Long after the helicopters leave and the search grids disappear from the wilderness, some rescuers still remember the cases where the track simply stopped and nothing beyond that point ever made sense again. Nahanni Valley, the expeditions that entered Canada's Valley of the Headless Men, far into the Northwest Territories, where the South Nahanni River cuts through limestone canyons and hot springs rise from fractured rock, the landscape opens into one of the most isolated wilderness corridors in Canada. The valley is part of the Nahanni National Park Reserve, a region defined by immense geological depth, steep canyon walls, and a river system that winds through terrain so remote that access often depends entirely on seasonal conditions and air transport. Even today, the scale of isolation remains difficult to fully grasp. With vast stretches of wilderness separating the valley from permanent settlements and roads, leaving much of its interior shaped primarily by water, rock, and time rather than human presence. Long before prospectors ever reached the region, oral histories among the Dean peoples described a vast and difficult terrain shaped by deep valleys, shifting rivers, and unpredictable isolation. These accounts refer to the land surrounding the South Nahanni River with a sense of caution rooted in lived experience, where navigation depended on understanding changing waterways and seasonal movement rather than fixed routes. While later interpretations often filtered these stories through outsider perspectives, the early descriptions consistently emphasized the valley's remoteness and the difficulty of travel through its canyon systems. When gold fever spread across northern Canada in the early 20th century, the Nahanni region became one of the remote destinations that attracted both opportunity seekers and those willing to risk extreme wilderness travel. Prospectors moved into the Mackenzie Mountains region as reports of mineral deposits circulated through frontier networks, and the promise of discovery drew individuals into areas where supply lines were fragile and survival depended on careful preparation. The South Nahanni River Valley, with its winding canyons and dense interior terrain, became one of the more challenging destinations for those attempting to establish claims in the northern wilderness. Mist and river fog often settled into the canyon system surrounding the South Nahanni River, reducing visibility to narrow corridors of rock and water that could change direction without warning. The geography of the valley created an environment where sound and sight behaved unpredictably, with echoes bouncing between canyon walls and shifting weather patterns rapidly altering conditions on the river. In certain stretches, cliffs rose sharply from the water's edge, forming enclosed passages where movement became constrained by both natural barriers and the river's forceful current. During the early decades of exploration, reports began circulating about prospectors who entered the Nahanni Valley and never returned to established routes or supply lines. These accounts varied in detail, often shaped by limited communication and the difficulty of confirming events in such remote regions. Some expeditions were recorded as incomplete or abandoned, while others simply vanished from correspondence without explanation. Over time, the accumulation of unresolved cases began contributing to a growing reputation surrounding the valley's interior. One of the earliest and most enduring cases involved the MacLeod brothers, whose journey into the valley became permanently associated with the reputation that later defined the region. Their remains were reportedly discovered in a condition that shocked early observers, with accounts describing decapitation and a partially destroyed campsite near a fire. While interpretations of the event differ across historical records and later retellings, the incident became one of the foundational stories that shaped how outsiders viewed the Nahanni region. It was this case that contributed significantly to the phrase Valley of the Headless Men, a name that would persist long after the original events faded into historical ambiguity. Scattered accounts from trappers and early explorers described abandoned camps, disrupted supplies, and evidence of travel that ended abruptly within the valley's interior. These findings were often inconsistent in detail, but they contributed to a pattern of uncertainty surrounding expeditions that entered deeper sections of the Nahanni drainage. In some cases, equipment appeared left behind in conditions suggesting sudden departure, while in others, routes simply stopped without a clear indication of what had occurred. The difficulty of verifying these reports in real time added to the growing uncertainty. Indigenous guides and local observers were often among the first to caution that certain sections of the Nahanni drainage required experience far beyond ordinary wilderness travel. Their knowledge of the terrain emphasized the unpredictable nature of river systems, seasonal flooding, and canyon navigation, where familiar routes could become dangerous or impassable, depending on environmental conditions. These warnings were rooted in a practical understanding of survival in the region rather than mystery, but they later became intertwined with the valley's growing reputation among outside observers. As mining interest increased, more expeditions entered the valley under the assumption that earlier disappearances were isolated incidents rather than part of a wider pattern. Prospectors, survey teams, and independent explorers continued to push into the region, motivated by both economic opportunity and the expanding frontier mindset of northern exploration. Each new entry into the valley added another layer of documentation, but not always resolution, as some expeditions returned with incomplete records or ambiguous accounts of their time inside the canyon system. Deep within the valley, river currents carved through limestone formations, creating passages that shifted constantly with seasonal water flow and erosion. The South Nahanni River's hydrology contributed to a dynamic landscape where channels could deepen, collapse, or redirect over time, altering the structure of navigation routes used by both indigenous travelers and later explorers. This constant geological movement made the valley not only remote but also unstable, in ways that complicated long-term mapping and traversal. Several patrols dispatched into the region later returned with incomplete accounts of terrain conditions that made navigation and tracking unusually difficult. These expeditions, often conducted by law enforcement or search groups responding to reported disappearances, described challenges related to visibility, river crossings, and canyon depth that limited operational effectiveness. In some cases, teams reported that environmental conditions forced them to abandon search efforts earlier than planned, while in others, the terrain itself restricted access to areas where earlier incidents were believed to have occurred. Decades after the earliest disappearances, the Nahanni region continued to attract search parties, attempting to verify or resolve long-standing reports of missing prospectors. Interest in the valley persisted not only among local authorities, but also among researchers and explorers seeking to understand whether the accumulated cases represented coincidence or environmental consequence. Each return to the valley added to the documented history of exploration, without necessarily reducing the uncertainty surrounding earlier events. Aircraft surveys and ground expeditions occasionally identified remnants of campsites or equipment, though many findings failed to produce clear conclusions about what had occurred. The presence of abandoned structures or scattered belongings often raised more questions than answers, particularly when no corresponding records existed to explain the circumstances of their abandonment. In such a remote environment, distinguishing between routine loss, environmental destruction, and unexplained disappearance became increasingly complex. stories surrounding the valley gradually spread beyond northern Canada, transforming Nahanni into a name associated with unexplained wilderness outcomes. Newspaper reports, frontier accounts, and later historical summaries contributed to a growing reputation that extended far beyond the region itself. Over time, the phrase Valley of the Headless Men became part of broader cultural awareness, even as historians continued to debate the accuracy and origins of the stories that contributed to its formation. Environmental conditions across the valley varied dramatically, with sections of open canyon giving way to dense forest, river rapids, and steep limestone walls. This variability created an environment where travel conditions could change rapidly over short distances, requiring constant adaptation from those moving through the region. The combination of water, elevation, and narrow passageways meant that even experienced travelers had to adjust continuously to shifting terrain. Search operations entering the region often reported how quickly the terrain could become disorienting, even for experienced wilderness teams. Navigation within canyon systems required careful attention to river flow and rock formations, while weather conditions could obscure visibility with little warning. In such an environment, maintaining consistent orientation became a significant challenge, particularly for teams unfamiliar with the valley's deeper interior. Some recovered accounts from early expeditions suggested that fear and rumour had begun influencing how later search parties interpreted the landscape. As stories of disappearances accumulated, each new expedition entered the valley already aware of its reputation, which inevitably shaped expectations and interpretations of environmental conditions. This psychological layer became part of the valley's broader history, blending perception and experience in ways that were difficult to separate after the fact. Despite repeated investigations, no single explanation emerged capable of accounting for every disappearance attributed to the Nahanni region. Some cases likely involved accidents, exposure, animal activity, or navigational failure in extremely harsh terrain, while others remain documented only through partial records or second-hand accounts. The combination of environmental difficulty and historical ambiguity ensured that not all incidents could be reconstructed with certainty. Over time, the valley's reputation became intertwined with both documented incidents and the growing mythology surrounding its most remote interior sections. Nahanni gradually shifted from being viewed solely as a challenging wilderness region into a place where unresolved stories accumulated across decades of exploration. This reputation persisted even as scientific surveys and park management improved access and understanding of the terrain. In today's discussions of northern wilderness history, Nahanni continues to be referenced as a place where expeditions repeatedly faced outcomes that defied simple categorization. Contemporary exploration has made the region more accessible than in earlier centuries, yet its deeper canyons still retain a sense of isolation, shaped by geography and history alike. The valley remains both a protected landscape and a subject of enduring fascination within accounts of unexplained wilderness outcomes. Even as modern expeditions continue to enter the canyon systems of the South Nahanni River, the valley still opens into the same silence that once swallowed those who never found their way back out. Aokigahara, the forest where even recovery teams lose their way. Search vehicles arriving at the foothills of Mount Fuji often stop at designated staging areas where equipment is checked before teams enter the forest boundary. At this point, operations remain procedural and controlled, with personnel organising ropes, communication devices, mapping tools and protective gear before stepping into terrain that is already known for its navigational difficulty. The transition from open ground into forest interior is treated with unusual caution in Japan, particularly in areas like Aokigahara, where visibility can change within a few steps and where standard orientation methods begin to lose reliability far sooner than expected. Official patrol records in Japan describe Aokigahara as an area requiring continuous monitoring due to the frequency of organised search deployments inside its boundaries. Managed as part of the Fuji-Hakone-Izu National Park system, the forest is not remote in the traditional sense of wilderness isolation, yet its interior conditions create a perception of separation once entry is made. Police and volunteer groups regularly operate within it, and the infrastructure supporting these operations reflects years of accumulated experience dealing with missing persons reports in a terrain that behaves differently from surrounding regions. Before any search begins inside Aokigahara, police and volunteer teams undergo strict coordination procedures intended to prevent separation once inside the forest. These procedures are not symbolic but practical, developed from repeated operational necessity. Teams are briefed on grid assignments, communication intervals, and withdrawal protocols designed to ensure that no unit becomes isolated beyond recovery range. In many cases, operations begin with clearly defined limits on how far each group may travel before returning to a designated checkpoint. Long rope lines are secured at fixed entry points so that search teams can maintain a physical reference path after leaving visible terrain behind. These ropes function as critical anchors in an environment where sightlines diminish rapidly under dense canopy cover. Once tied to stable points near forest entrances, they extend inward along planned routes, allowing searchers to physically trace their return path even when visual cues disappear. The reliance on such simple tools highlights the extent to which natural visibility alone cannot be trusted inside the deeper forest zones. Grid-based movement patterns are used to control how searchers advance through sections of forest where visual landmarks quickly disappear. Teams are assigned specific sectors and instructed to sweep areas methodically rather than moving freely, a system intended to ensure full coverage of terrain while reducing the risk of disorientation. Each section is mapped and revisited systematically, creating overlapping search patterns designed to account for the forest's uniform appearance and limited distinguishing features at ground level. Once inside the densest areas, even experienced personnel have reported difficulty confirming direction, despite following established compass protocols. The forest floor is covered with thick layers of volcanic rock, moss and undergrowth that obscure natural sight lines, while the canopy above reduces visibility of the sky to small fragmented openings. In such conditions, traditional orientation methods can become less intuitive, requiring constant recalibration of position and repeated verification against known reference points. Return navigation depends heavily on pre-placed markers positioned at intervals along entry routes leading back toward cleared ground. These markers serve as fixed points of reference in an environment where spatial awareness can degrade quickly over distance and time. Without them, the interior of the forest can appear visually repetitive, with similar tree density and ground composition, making it difficult to distinguish one area from another. The markers, therefore, function as both psychological reassurance and practical navigation tools. Deeper sections of the forest force search teams into slower movement as fallen lava rock and dense vegetation limit step-by-step visibility. Aokigahara's terrain is shaped by ancient volcanic activity from Mount Fuji, leaving behind irregular rock formations hidden beneath soil and plant growth. Movement across such ground requires constant attention to footing, while visual scanning is restricted to short distances. Progress becomes incremental, and spatial awareness narrows to immediate surroundings rather than broader orientation. Sound within Aokigahara becomes heavily muted, with distance cues from footsteps or calls failing to carry in predictable ways. The density of vegetation and irregular terrain absorbs and distorts noise, creating an environment where auditory signals lose reliability as navigation aids. In search operations, communication often depends more on radios than voice calls, even at relatively short distances, because natural acoustics cannot be depended upon to transmit clear direction or distance information. Compass checks are repeated more frequently as teams move further from entry lines and into terrain with fewer distinguishable reference points. While compasses remain reliable tools in principle, their effectiveness depends on the user's ability to maintain consistent positional awareness, which becomes increasingly difficult in environments where visual confirmation is limited. Search personnel often pause at intervals to confirm direction, correct bearing, and ensure alignment with mapped routes. During extended searches, coordination between separate units becomes increasingly dependent on radio contact rather than visual tracking. Teams operating in adjacent sectors may lose sight of one another within moments of entering denser sections of forest, making verbal coordination essential for maintaining operational structure. Scheduled check-ins ensure that no unit drifts outside assigned boundaries, but even these systems rely on the assumption that each group remains correctly oriented within its designated area. Even when teams remain within assigned sectors, maintaining consistent orientation can require repeated remapping of position against known markers. The forest's internal uniformity makes it difficult to distinguish subtle changes in terrain, leading to situations where searchers must verify location through multiple reference points, rather than relying on immediate recognition. This process is a standard procedure, but it becomes more frequent in deeper zones where environmental consistency reduces visual differentiation. Entry points into Aokigahara are reinforced with signage and markers, intended to ensure that every team begins and ends operations from clearly defined positions. These markers are not only navigational tools but administrative safeguards, ensuring that search operations can be tracked and verified from start to finish. They represent the controlled boundary between known terrain and the more complex interior zones where visibility and orientation become less reliable. Environmental conditions inside the forest shift subtly with elevation and density, creating zones where movement becomes increasingly restricted. Changes in vegetation thickness, ground stability, and light penetration can occur gradually over short distances, making it difficult for search teams to identify clear transitions between areas. This gradual shift contributes to the forest's reputation for disorientation, as there is rarely a single moment when navigation becomes difficult. It happens incrementally. Some search operations have required repeated reorientation checks after teams report difficulty confirming their exact position within mapped sectors. These checks involve cross-referencing compass readings, marker locations, and communication logs to ensure that all teams remain aligned with operational plans. In some instances, personnel have retraced sections of forest multiple times simply to confirm that their perceived position matches recorded coordinates. Recovery efforts inside Aokigahara often extend for long periods due to the forest's ability to conceal individuals within extremely limited sight ranges. Dense undergrowth, fallen trees, and uneven volcanic terrain can obscure visibility even at close distances, requiring thorough and repeated searches of the same areas. The nature of the environment means that the absence of evidence cannot always be immediately interpreted as confirmation of absence. Official procedures emphasize withdrawal protocols designed to ensure that search teams exit along the same controlled paths they entered. These protocols are critical in environments where deviation from established routes can lead to unnecessary risk or loss of orientation. Teams are trained to prioritize return pathways as much as forward search movement, ensuring that every entry is matched by a reliable exit strategy. Over time, repeated operations in the forest have led to extensive documentation of its navigational challenges without altering its physical structure. Reports compiled from decades of search activity consistently emphasize the same core difficulty. The forest does not behave unpredictably in a violent sense, but rather in a quiet and consistent reduction of orientation clarity. This characteristic has made it one of the most studied and carefully managed search environments in Japan. Even modern search technology, including GPS systems and coordinated mapping, still requires strict adherence to ground-level markers inside dense sections of Aokigahara. Electronic systems provide valuable reference data, but they do not eliminate the need for physical navigation support when visibility drops and terrain becomes visually repetitive. For this reason, traditional markers remain a central part of operational planning. In prolonged operations, teams sometimes retrace steps multiple times to confirm alignment with earlier entry paths. This repetition is not considered unusual in difficult terrain, but in Aokigahara it occurs frequently enough to be a standard part of operational expectations. Searchers must continually verify that their movement remains consistent with planned routes, rather than assuming directional accuracy based on perception alone. Search procedures emphasize that no team should proceed beyond the marker visibility range without maintaining a retraceable route. This principle exists to prevent irreversible disorientation within forest zones, where natural landmarks cannot be relied upon for navigation. It reflects a fundamental recognition that the forest structure requires controlled movement at all times, regardless of experience level. The moment the last visible marker disappears behind the trees, the forest offers no guarantee that the path back will still resemble the one that led inward.